Okay, this is lymphatic system part 2. Unfortunately, if I put it on full screen, it blocks out a lot of my slides, so I'm going to leave it this way. Okay, so quick review. In every single capillary bed that there is in your body, there's millions of these, the small arterial capillaries, the red side of the capillaries, ooze fluid, so to speak, right? There's a little bit of fluid that's pushed out through the capillaries into the general tissue, the cells right outside those capillaries, and it becomes tissue fluid. And that's a pretty good situation because it's good for those tissues to be hydrated and to have the nutrients and oxygen that comes from the blood. But the fluid would build up and become too much if it weren't drained by the lymphatic capillaries and lymphatic system. So excess tissue fluid flows into or is pushed into lymphatic capillaries and always, always, always returns almost to your heart, to the blue blood right before the heart, it's actually not the vena cava, but it's just before the vena cava, right? Just before the heart in the veins there. And this is schematic of every capillary bed in your body. There's a million of them, right? They're in the muscles of your arms, they're in your toes, they're in all your organs, and every single one of these capillary beds nearby has lymphatic capillaries draining and flowing towards the heart. And okay, stuck there for a moment. All right, the cardiovascular system has a pump, right? Blood is pumped by the heart. And that's what gets it moving. What gets lymph moving in lymph vessels, especially lymph that's going against gravity? Say there's lymph flowing from your feet to your heart. What gets it moving? So, surprisingly enough, this is an image of a lymphatic vessel, and these are muscles. Muscular contraction presses on lymph vessels in such a way that it stimulates the movement or the flow of lymph. So essential to good lymphatic flow, to good lymphatic circulation, is movement and exercise. Isn't that interesting? There's also these little valves. These are just like the ones we studied in our heart. They're little doors that are one way and that prevent backflow. So if pressure is put on this side of a valve, it will open. But if pressure were being put on this side of the valve, it would stay shut. This is probably a pretty good diagram of it too, right? When this is pressed upon, it will open up. But if it's being pressed upon here, it will shut. So they're valves that ensure flow in one direction. They prevent backflow. So muscular contraction and valves are the method for lymphatic flow. And this is just a parenthetical remark. Your veins have these same valves because your veins have the same problem, really. The arteries get the big pump from the heart. The veins don't because they go through the capillary beds and they lose a lot of their blood pressure. So they have the same valves. Okay, the lymphatic system has two main functions. The first is what we just talked about, the return route to the bloodstream so that tissue fluid is returned, also called drainage sometimes. And the second one has to do with the immune system. The lymphatic system is a part of the immune system. It has a really important immune role because of lymph nodes. So notice that wherever lymph is flowing through lymphatic vessels, wherever it is, it will be traveling through lymph nodes. Always flow through lymph nodes. And what are lymph nodes? They're like these little nodules. They're pretty small. They're kind of bean-sized or chickpea-sized, and they're full of white blood cells. They're just packed, densely packed with white blood cells. And this is really important because what do white blood cells do? They kill and fight pathogens. So before I go to the other diagram, just notice that this diagram shows this lymph node has 4 vessels which have lymph flowing into them, but only one vessel in which lymph is exiting. When it flows in, it's called an afferent vessel, A for arriving. When it leaves, it's called an efferent vessel, E for exiting, right? And all lymph nodes have more entrances than they do exits. Here's another diagram. So same thing. Here, this one has even more afferent or arriving vessels and just this big outgoing vessel here. And why is that the case? Why do you think that might be the case? So The reason is, let's see how I expressed it here. It forces lymph to travel further and longer in and through the lymph node, right? It passes through more centers, which are full of many white blood cells. You can imagine that if there were many exits, some of the lymph could take a quick, say there was an exit here, this lymph here could take a quick exit and travel through very little of the lymph node. And so they wouldn't pass through many white blood cells and would not get the chance to have its pathogens screened and filtered out by white blood cells. Okay, quick note about white blood cells. This is the white blood cell that we already studied. It's called the macrophage. Phage is in phagocytosis, right, which is the ingesting and digesting of pathogens. There's a lysosome with digestive enzymes, then the bacteria or the virus is digested and literally spit out through exocytosis. It's non-specific. Anything that is not a cell of your body will be attacked in this way. There's also a whole category of white blood cells called lymphocytes. You may have heard of T cells and B cells. You don't need to know that term now. Lymphocytes identify specific pathogens by their surface protein. So this represents a pathogen. This is its special proteins. And a lymphocyte, they wrote T cell, but you can just call it a lymphocyte. A lymphocyte is able to recognize specific pathogens, as in the chickenpox pathogen versus the scarlet fever pathogen versus coronavirus, etc., etc. Identify them and then launch an attack that's specific to that pathogen. It uses what it knows about the surface proteins to attack that pathogen in a particular way. So it's called a targeted attack, and it's called specific immunity. And so these are lymphocytes. And so as you imagine, the lymphocytes have a much tougher job. They're much more specific, much more intelligent, if you will. So they have to be better trained at what they do. And you'll see that's important later on. Okay, this is just a summary of lymph nodes. Notice that lymph vessels have this advantage of getting white blood cells to circulate all through your body because the lymph is passing through lymph nodes, which are packed with white blood cells, and it gets the white blood cells moving around. Okay, quick summary here. Lymph nodes filter lymph, whereas the liver and the kidney filter blood. So lymph nodes filter lymph. And what do lymph nodes remove? Pathogens. Liver and kidneys, on the other hand, remove toxins. Actually, kidneys have some other jobs, but we haven't really talked about it much because we haven't done urinary yet. I think we're going to do urinary system next. So you don't need to know all this 1, 2, 3. You can just think of it as they remove toxins. Okay, there's a couple other organs in the lymphatic system that we're going to go over. The spleen is right here. Bone marrow is the soft tissue that's inside of large bones. All our very large bones have bone marrow inside them. The thymus is a gland right here in front of your heart, and tonsils, which are pretty famous, so you know about them, as well as a duct called the thoracic duct. So let's take a look at those other organs. All right, so it looks like I started with thoracic duct. So just like all vessels, lymph vessels converge. One vessel converges into the other, and they grow bigger and bigger. And one of the major convergence vessels, a duct is just meaning, a vessel or a pipe, is called the thoracic duct. So it's this one right here. See how many lymph vessels are flowing into it? It flows up behind the heart, and then look what it does. All the lymph from many different vessels flows into this blood vessel here. Don't worry about the name of it, but you can think of it as blue blood just before the vena cava. So the thoracic duct is kind of like a large lymph vessel into which many lymph vessels converge. And it pours lymph back into the bloodstream just before the vena cava, just before the heart. Okay, the importance of bone marrow is that lymphocytes are produced in it. They're produced first in the bone marrow and then in the thymus. Let's look at that in a little bit more detail. All right, inside the bone is bone marrow, right? This soft tissue here. And bone marrow is the place where red blood cells and all white blood cells are produced. Don't worry about the appearance of those. We'll hopefully study those later on, but all you need to know about is the 2 white blood cells we studied. Macrophages and lymphocytes are produced in the bone marrow, as well as red blood cells. The lymphocytes, because they're more complex and they're more, they've got a tougher job, more intelligent job, if you will. They're not, when they leave the bone marrow, they're not complete. The macrophages are complete, the red blood cells are complete, the lymphocytes are not. The lymphocells finish their development, they kind of get trained, if you will, in a gland called the thymus gland. That's what this is right here. It's a gland that's behind your sternum. Sternum is your breastbone, that hard, flat bone right in the middle of your chest. Behind your sternum, in front of your heart, it's got two lobes. It's got this funny characteristic. It atrophies with age. That's why elderly people have weak immune systems, or that's one of the reasons why. And it's involved with the production and the maturation, although you could perhaps say the development of lymphocytes, right? Of the smart white blood cells, the ones that launch targeted attacks. Okay. Tonsils, you don't need to know the three names, although it's kind of cool to learn them. These are the ones, the lingual, at the back of your tongue. They're ones at the back of your palate, and they're ones that are basically in the nasopharynx. These three sets of, more or less, they're lymph nodes. They're not exactly lymph nodes, but the tonsils are like lymphatic tissue, almost a lymph node. They're pretty famous because a lot of people get them removed because they get easily infected. This is just another picture of them. They're kind of funny looking. Okay, this is non-essential information. So if you're interested, this is for your own satisfaction. These little patches of lymphatic tissue are found all throughout the intestine, small and large intestine. And they're kind of like tonsils, lymphatic tissue. That's important because food brings in lots of pathogens. So as anything that's not killed by the stomach can be targeted by these lymph nodes. Okay. The spleen is the biggest and most important lymph node at all. In a way, a really simple definition of it is just a big lymph node. But it's got a couple other functions, which we're going to look at. This is a great picture of the spleen. You see where it's located on the left side, where the stomach is. Even further left on the very edge, the spleen is tucked there, a little bit under the liver on the far left of the stomach. So the spleen has a dual function, which I like to call a white function and a red function. Let me just jump ahead. You'll see that it literally has red tissue. It's called a red pulp, and white tissue. So the two functions kind of have separate sets of cells inside the spleen. So the white function is much like lymph node function. It's about filtering and killing pathogens. It's also a place where white blood cells are produced and stored. So it can have a storage of white blood cells so that when you have a sudden need of them, the spleen has some extra ones. The red function is just like the white one, but instead of filtering lymph, it filters blood. It filters out red blood cells which have grown old or lost their shape and lost their utility, because red blood cells don't live forever. I think their lifespan is like 3 or 4 months. So your body, which has millions and millions of red blood cells, has to constantly be making new ones, but also getting rid of the old ones. And the spleen is the organ which determines, oh, this is an old red blood cell, no longer useful or helpful. And so it destroys them in the same way it destroys pathogens. They're eaten up by macrophages. And I have a really ridiculous cartoon to help you remember that. This is a macrophage. This cartoon is really weird, but I thought it would help you remember. Gobbling up a red blood cell. To remember, this would be an old or damaged red blood cell, not a good one. This is an actual photograph of that happening, if you can believe it. That is a lymphocyte. This part here is the red blood cell. This part here is the border. This is the lymphocyte engulfing it, right? In this picture they colored the red blood cell red so it's easier to see. So that's actually a lymphocyte engulfing 4 different red blood cells at once. Isn't that weird? Okay, so that is a summary of everything you need to know about the lymphatic system. So just make sure you can identify all of these. The spleen, the thymus, the bone marrow, the tonsils, of course, and then the lymph nodes and the lymph vessels. Payer's patches are optional if you want to know them. And I think that's everything. Okay.